So this November, you may have seen the announcement, I think it went out here. I've been honored to have been chosen to be the minister for a Unitarian pilgrimage to Transylvania. And no, we're not worshiping vampires. Transylvania happens to be one of the places in the Reformation where Unitarianism was particularly strong. And so the Appleton congregation has a partner church in a significantly historic town called Deva, where one of the leaders was martyred. And so they've been doing this for a couple of decades now, I think since the mid-90s, leading a group over every couple of years, and they found that it would be important to have a minister go along with them. So I'm able to go, so I'm going to go on this in the beginning of November. Now, because of that, it's caused me to start refreshing my memory on Unitarian history, and because if I'm supposed to be the expert, it would be a good idea if I actually was. So it caused me to pull out some information, and I wanted to share some of that with you this morning. So the source of this is the Epic of Unitarianism. It was compiled by David Park. The act of religious tolerance and freedom of conscience. It's a quote. His Majesty our Lord reaffirms that in every place the preachers shall preach and explain the gospel, each according to his understanding of it. And if the congregation like it, well. If not, no one shall compel them, for their souls would not be satisfied. But they shall be permitted to keep a preacher whose teaching they approve. Therefore, none of the superintendents or others shall abuse the preachers. No one shall be reviled for his religion by anyone, and it is not permitted that anyone should threaten anyone unless by imprisonment, And it is not permitted that anyone should threaten anyone else by imprisonment or by removal from his post for his teaching. For faith is the gift of God. This comes from hearing, which hearing is by the word of God. That's a paraphrased quote from the Act of Religious Tolerance and the Freedom of Conscience from 1561. So in 1561, King John Sigismund became the king of Transylvania, and he was the first and only Unitarian king in history. Now it says, and I'll quote again from David Park's work, John was frail and artistic, an accomplished linguist, and a superior monarch. Above all, he was deeply interested in religion and sought to pacify conflicts between Roman Catholics, Greek Orthodox, Lutherans, Calvinists, and Unitarians in his realm. Out of personal conviction, therefore, and practical political considerations, he fostered a policy of open discussion and broad toleration from all viewpoints, which made Transylvania the freest country in Europe in religious matters. So this Unitarian king, and he only was king for about 5 years because he got pneumonia and died, but he did this, it was the first proclamation of religious freedom in Europe after the Reformation, and so for a while it was the freest country in the world. So it's a proud moment in our history and something that we should be aware of if you weren't before. And so one of the things tied to that was there was this council, and it's called the Diet of Torah, where they were debating this, whether they could actually have religious freedom existing in this realm. And there's this picture, and I think I wasn't sure, I just kind of sent it in the newsletter, I don't know if it went out or not, but there's this picture of Francis David with his hand up, and you know, it's like those pictures are, it's all kind of muted in the background, and this like holy golden light covers him. And he's saying a quote, and he was actually saying the quote that Barb read earlier, that we need not think alike to love alike. And for centuries, Unitarians had quoted him as having said that. And then somebody did a little bit more research and said, well, you know, John Wellesley published it in a pamphlet before that, and it was disseminated throughout Europe. So they're pretty sure that he picked up on that and re-quoted it, which is fine. It's a lovely quote. But it really comes to the heart of who we are. We need not think alike to love alike. And so so this was the 16th century, and now you bring it into the 21st century, and we still have that same premise going along today. And today it has to do with our principles. So those of you that are not familiar with Unitarian Universalism, we democratically, in about the 80s and 90s, came up with unifying principles that we all agree as congregations to lift up and uphold. And the introduction to that says that Unitarian Universalist congregations affirm and promote 7 principles which we hold as strong values and moral guides. Now, we, most of you know, we are not a doctrine-driven faith organization. We have no faith test that you have to come and pass this test to be able to belong, and we don't kick you out for not adhering to some faith. But so this is instead of it. These are the guidelines. These are the moral things that we do uphold and that we do believe we agree in common in a common framework. And 3 of them are kind of tied to this concept of we need not think alike to love alike. The first principle, which it gets quoted often, is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And I did a sermon on this last fall, often take that to say we are all worthy of being loved, no exceptions. Because it's one thing to just say, oh, I can intellectually believe that everybody should have human rights and have equal rights. But when you get to the point where everyone has the inherent worth of being loved, that takes it more to the heart, and that's a little bit more difficult. So that's where I am in that space of the first principle, and it kind of ties a little bit more to that think alike, love alike concept. But then you have the third and fourth principles. The third principle, summarized, is an acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. And the fourth is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. So those two, once again, spiritual growth tends to be a little bit more of the heart-based, and a search for truth and meaning is a little bit more of the intellectual sides of the heart and the head. We believe that everyone has the right to their own journey, and that's what our faith is all about. So it kind of ties way back again to that Reformation statement that we need not think alike to love alike. Well, I started putting a little bit more thought to that. And I said, once again, we all sit here and we say, yes, these are the 7 principles we believe in. But when push comes to shove, when the rubber hits the road, I think often we find it kind of difficult to really live into what we think we believe. And so I started listing some examples. And I started with the easy ones. And then I kind of got into a little bit more of the difficult ones. And I just want to throw them out there for you to ponder them. And just remind you that we're going to have a congregational response and we can discussion at 11:20 later, so we can, let you mull them over and we can talk about it together after that. So the first one, I think, is pretty obvious. It's the spiritual, not religious. And you've heard that that's a description. If you want to start doing stereotyping and generic descriptions, that's a description for the millennials. That typically they're not aligned with any particular religious denomination or tradition, and they will say, oh, I'm a very spiritual person, meaning I think that they believe in something higher or greater than themselves, believing in some greater good that we are headed towards, hopefully. But I'm not religious, which is a euphemism for I don't want to be caught dead in an organized church, right? I don't want to have to be forced to believe a certain doctrine. I don't want to go to a service that's the hymn sandwich with a little preacher standing up there talking in between like we're doing right now. And I think if you go out into one of those, help me somebody, those online quizzes of what your faith is, what's it called? No, there's a quiz online. There's a couple of them. What is it?
Ministry.com.
It might be. I knew you'd probably know.
Yeah,
it's one of those like, what do you believe? I think it's whatdoyoubelieve.com.
Yeah.
And you fill it out, and if you fill it out, often I've heard that, particularly millennials, it'll pop up while you're the closest to Unitarian Universalist. They'll say they're none, they're no religious affiliation, but if you ask them what they think about and how they perceive the world, and frankly, what is religion other than helping us to find meaning in life and our orientation to the universe, when they answer those questions, it typically ends up being, well, you're very close to Unitarian Universalism, which then is very close to, I would say, we are probably spiritual but not religious. But that's kind of where you all are, sitting in organized religion, right? So anyway, that was my first one to say, okay, that's a group that you'll get people that aren't born and raised Unitarian Universalists, but yet they find us and are so happy to be here. The second group I wrote down was mindfully Buddhist. And I wrote this down because that's how I would describe my spouse. We were both raised Lutheran, but don't really practice anything from Lutheranism anymore. And she has really found solace in Buddhism and is part of a Sangha, does a lot of Buddhist retreats, meditates every night. We share my home office and her meditation room are the same. So there's a lot of Buddhist statues sitting around, that kind of thing. This is another one where for Unitarian Universalists, it's pretty easy to accept that because for one thing, classically Buddhists do not believe in a deity, so there's not a specific God that you're required to believe in, although some would argue some sects of Buddhism have elevated Buddha up to a deity, but nonetheless it doesn't really have a creed, and it's always more internally focused. It's all about finding mindfulness, spreading love and peace throughout the world, which are very much in sync with what we generally believe. The third one gets a little bit trickier. So I call this the charismatic Christian. So it's the person who probably found us not because they believe in the doctrine of most Christian churches, but they believe in the teachings of Christ and who Christ or Jesus was, the person of Jesus, and is very much wanting to live that kind of life and that kind of style. But I put the word charismatic in front of it because this one shocked me. When I went into seminary at Meadville Lombard, I come out of that religious humanist tradition of the fellowships up in the upper Midwest kind of thing. And we're all heady kind of people and kind of stoic and not showing a lot of emotion. But there was this younger group of seminarians that proclaimed themselves Christian, and when we would be in services would do a lot more of raising of hands and a little bit more of a charismatic style. And I was actually, I think my sermon last month or a couple of months ago when I was talking about John, who was being ordained, the first time he and I worshiped together, he was praying like this, and he actually leaned over and apologized to me first. Because he goes, this is just my tradition. I come from the South, and this is how I do it. I'm like, that's cool. So it's just a little bit more, a little bit different than the traditions that we're used to out here in the Midwest. So there's a group that we might not think alike or act alike in our worship style, but yet we can love alike. So then, sort of flipping to the other side, I would say that I call it the scientifically humanist. So a humanist generally believes that human beings are accountable to themselves for all the bad and the good in the world. It doesn't come from an outside being that causes things to happen, that we tend to have to we have our own agency to solve things. And there's a lot of different types of humanists and where that goes. The scientifically humanist would be the folks who, and I have a lot of friends like this, that everything has to be scientifically proven before they're going to believe it. And so there's no such thing as a leap of faith. You have to go through the scientific method to prove it. And so sometimes those folks are a little bit hard to get along with if you want to do something that's just like, I can't prove it, but I just feel this way kind of thing. And then they would look on me as a little bit, well, that's a little woo-woo kind of out there kind of thing. So they're part of our crowd as well. And so by contrast, deliberately, I put the spiritually pagan. I have a couple of friends who are, one is Druid, one is Wicca, and one I would call is just Gaian. Gaia is a concept that the whole universe, and particularly the Earth, is a living being and is self-aware, I guess would be sort of the concept of it. And these three are all Unitarian Universalists and very spiritual in how they approach nature and trees and the world and everything out there. And they're very dear to me. Then you get to the even more difficult ones in our space, in our tradition here in the Midwest. So I called it the ritualistic Muslim or Jewish. So it's Ramadan, folks. So I have Unitarian Universalist friends, believe it or not, who follow Muslim traditions, and they are doing Ramadan right now. And so I am just astounded at their strength and willingness to do the rituals of praying 5 times a day and fasting during the day. I can't even fast for 2 hours. And so, I mean, to me, I just really hold them up as that is really cool that your faith calls you to do that and you're willing to do that. And when I was in chaplaincy, another one of the chaplains was a Hasidic Jewish rabbi. And he and I became very good friends. And I finally said, you know, I come from this Unitarian Universalist loosey-goosey kind of space, and you are sitting there in this head-to-toe black and white with the hat and the longer hair and the buttoned-up coat, and it's like 90 degrees out. And I said, I just don't get it. And so he didn't laugh at me or disdain me. He just carefully explained how everything he does was a ritual that was, to him, tied to the presence of God. And so every single thing, he goes, I button it this way because of this, and this is leading me to remember. So that was the whole point. The goal for him was to live a life where God is constantly present in his life. And so all these rituals made sense to him, and he saw them as very freeing and very uplifting, whereas, you know, coming from where I come from, it looked very restricting. So I had a whole new appreciation for that. So then, these are all spiritual traditions or religious traditions that I know Unitarian Universalists that accompany all of these, although the Hasidic Jewish rabbi isn't technically a Unitarian Universalist. But then you get into politics. And so I think that's the one that we are much more familiar with. And I hate to break this to you, but we're not the Church of the Democratic Party or the Green Party or the Socialist Party or the Republican Party or whatever. We are an organization that lifts up the 7 principles, the inherent worth and dignity of everyone. And so certainly we lift up issues that tend to be on the more liberal end of things, because if you're going to believe that everyone has inherent worth and dignity, that means you can't leave people out, you can't discriminate, that kind of stuff. So that's always a little bit difficult for us to realize that there are Unitarian Universalists that maybe are a little bit more on the conservative side on a couple of specific issues. Those of you that weren't blessed to come here the day of the blizzard, I came down here and we actually had a wonderful discussion, and it was brought up that some among us are strong believers in very traditionally conservative issues, but yet fervent Unitarian Universalists. This is all part of our big tent. This is all part of being Unitarian Universalists. This is all part of that 16th century proclamation that we need not think alike to act alike. And so I want us to really ground ourselves in how difficult that really is sometimes. So then I started thinking about the future of Unitarian Universalism. One of the benefits of being in seminary and then being a minister is you tend to go to General Assembly a lot. It's kind of expected. And for those of you that don't know, General Assembly is a gathering in North America every summer. It's usually the 3rd week of June for Unitarian Universalists across the country. And it rotates around Canada and the United States because, frankly, it's kind of expensive to travel there and have hotels and that kind of thing. So it tends to rotate around the country so that everybody can have it locally from time to time. This summer, actually, it's in Kansas City. And I've been going for maybe 6 years, and over that time, and I've been told even before that time, you've seen a change, quite a dramatic change, from being, frankly, people that are very well-grounded in white culture, white humanist culture, being up in the front, to much more diverse and much more open to ways of worshiping and thinking about things and the topics. And it's not a tolerance of diversity, it's clearly a celebration and an embracing of diversity. And it's amazing. And there's a movement right now in the Unitarian Universalist Association to acknowledge that white supremacy has dominated a lot. Even though we're very well-intentioned and good-minded people, it's all been led mostly by white guys, right? And so trying to dismantle that quickly, and the saying is moving the marginalized to the center and making space for that. And I'm going to say this, and you're probably going to go, what a doofus. But last summer, I was in New Orleans, and General Assembly was in New Orleans. And the worship services were phenomenal. And there's a particular worship leader who's African American out of the Ann Arbor congregation who's off the charts stellar. I want to learn a lot from him. And I noticed that in the worship and in the parliamentary proceedings and in almost everything that was going on, there were people of color in leadership positions up in front. And I'll be honest with you, I got really cynical at first because I thought, oh, that's great. I'm glad that's happening, but I hope to God it wasn't that they found somebody that's a person of color and throw them up there because we needed to have some quota filled or something. I was very negative about it. And you know what? I was ashamed that I thought about that because these people blew me away. Their talent was phenomenal. And I said that to a friend of mine, and she's Hispanic, and she looked at me and goes, duh. I think that's the point, Jim. And so it's just I found it very encouraging, a really great time to be a Unitarian Universalist. And people like me, old white guys, can step back and watch this, just everything blossom in a way that I never expected to happen before. And then one more thing I wanted to mention, because I think we're going to see more of it in the congregations, or at least my involvement, and it's kind of this unity tour idea, is rather than focus on individual social justice issues, and Unitarian Universalists, particularly in GA, can just get wrapped around the axle on a particular issue, because one of the purposes of General Assembly is for us to democratically debate and vote on what is going to be the center issue of focus for the next year. And it gets kind of ugly sometimes. Like one person wants to make sure that their issue is better than somebody else's. And it's a movement instead towards the intersectionality of social justice. Being mindful that environmental degradation isn't just about having clean water to drink and clean air and having a beautiful landscape, but remembering that the folks that live next to the toxic waste dumps are usually the people of color who can't afford to live anywhere else. And then it's wrapped into all kinds of other issues and their rights. So it's really trying to focus on the intersectionality of all of these issues. And that's where my friend Tim Corden is coming with his hippy-dippy bus to really help us all pull together and remember that we're in this together. Okay, so I know I'm running out of time, but I wanted to say what I've described is trying to give you a sense of how big and broad this whole idea of we need not think alike to love alike really is, and how Unitarian Universalism really embraces that, and to bring you back to the idea of the covenant. Once again, we do not have a doctrine by which I can vote whether you can be in or out, whether you agree to this doctrine, but rather we have a covenant. And it's a covenant of healthy relationships, how we shall be in covenant with one another, so that when things pop up where I don't agree with you, I'm pulled back into covenant to remember, oh, but we agreed to love each other even if I don't have to agree with you. So it's this simple concepts, like when somebody does something that rubs you wrong, you think, I'm going to assume they were well-intentioned. I'm going to assume that that was with a loving heart. Now, we can talk about it and figure out why we don't agree, and we can agree to disagree, but it's all about the relationships is what holds us together, and that loving alike rather than thinking alike. And if you think about it, the come whoever you are that we sang, I mean, if you take that literally, it's come whoever you are. So that's a pretty wild statement. And then I'll go back to the children's story that I read. Like I said to the kids, the problem with that book is it wasn't immediate acceptance. That cat had to prove that the cat could be like a dog to be fit in for acceptance. And that's not what this congregation or any UU congregation is about. It's supposed to be immediate acceptance and approaching people that are different than ourselves with a sense of curiosity So let's assume that if they visited a few times, there's something about this place that they like, something that they find meaningful, that is helping them with their orientation in life. But yet, they're very different than us. So the idea is, instead of like, okay, there's that person over there that doesn't look like they'd agree with me, so I'm not going to go talk to them, but rather approach them more with a curiosity, like, you obviously like it here, so help me understand, what is your background? Where are you from? What is this going on? You know, that kind of an attitude instead. Be the dogs that like want the cat there, rather than the cat having to prove that they belong first. I just want to give an example from work, because I find this kind of humorous. Many of you know that I worked for Kimberly-Clark for 24 years, and I am now in my 11th day of retirement, so I can go into full-time ministry. So Kimberly-Clark is a big, well-resourced company and has a lot of training classes, and I was a manager, so I took a lot of training classes. And one of them was this color wheel training. That was our name for it. It had some fancy name that I don't remember. And I know many of you were teachers and come from government, and you all have kinds of well-run training programs. But I just want to give you a hint of this one. Because I'm a visual thinker, it really helped me grasp the concepts. And so we all took these tests, and basically the concept was that there were 4 personality styles. I know there's many more than that, but it was limited down to 4 personality styles. And the test kind of showed you which are the ones that are your dominant, which are the ones that just show up naturally, and then which are the ones that you can do them. Most people can do all 4, but what are the ones that require a lot of energy and are just exhausting for you to manifest in a crowd, right? And so then after we did that, and we worked with other people that weren't like us, and they mapped out everybody in their departments and all that kind of thing, we got these little like Lego-y things, which I thought were really cool, and I'm going to tell you about them real quick. So they were not only colored, but they gave you this little tagline to help you remember what it stood for. So the green was "Show me you care." So this is the kind of person that, above all else, just needed to have that personal relationship with the other employees, that they cared about them on a personal level. The yellow was "Involve me," that they felt that they always needed to be a part of what was going on, and just would feel betrayed if they weren't. The blue is "Give me the details." These are your detail people. Really? And then red is my favorite. It's "Be bright, be brief, be gone." So these are the driver people. Okay? So I worked in a world of red and blues. Okay, they're the drivers, the details, all that kind of stuff. I am a solid yellow-green. So for 24 years, and this, by the way, is the dominant profile of most ministers. So for 24 years, I had to navigate through how to exist in this world. And these things really helped me, because what we did is every person, and pretty much everybody in the company had finally taken it, you would put them in the order of how you stacked up. And it would be on your desk. And so when somebody walked in, I'd know right away what they were about. So for example, this is me. And so people knew that they walked into my office, if they wanted my attention, we had to talk about the weekend, and how's the family, and how's the kids. My boss, on the other hand, was this. And so, but we got along really, really well. So every Monday morning when I'd have my one-on-one with him, I'd walk in on purpose and go, "Terry, tell me about your weekend. How's your family?" And he goes, "Shut up." So we got along quite well. So my point is, I found this really, really helpful to understand different people. And one other story, I had somebody who worked for me that he was brilliant, and I trusted his opinion. And one day at a staff meeting, I thought I was doing a good thing by saying, "You know, I don't care about your details, I just trust you, let's go with whatever we're going to do." After the meeting, he came into my office and pulled me aside. He's a deep blue, right? The detail guy. He goes, "You know, Jim, I know what you were trying to do, but you never tell detail people you don't care about their details." And he goes, "You can just say, you know what, we don't have time to go through it. I'm sure it's wonderful work, but I trust what you're recommending, and let's move forward." So outstanding counseling, and it helped us open up conversations. So my goal would be that we would have something like this attached to each of your name tags. I can figure out who you are right away. You can figure out who I am.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a little impractical. But kidding aside, I do believe that congregations, in fact Unitarian Universalist congregations, we should be stellar because we live in a covenantal faith environment. We should be stellar at this kind of stuff. We should really understand how to understand each other and then how to adjust ourselves, because we're very flexible people to be able to do this. So one of my goals in this next year is to come up with some sort of type of training, and I'm going to see if the UUA has something like this, or if not, the woman who runs this is a Unitarian Universalist, and I could probably swipe some of her stuff, and come up with some sort of kind of classes, training that if you want to, we can take here. I think it would really help us all be living in covenant with one another. So that's my idea of creative engagement, hence the title this morning. So I want to close with that in our space, people often from outside Unitarian Universalism say, well, what do you worship? You don't even all believe in God. What do you worship? And I'd say, you know what, we worship in the sense of lifting up relationships. Relationships are the most important thing. Relationships with each other, and then relationships with our world. And so the most important thing we can do is strengthen these relationships with one another while we think differently. And folks, if we can get that right, then we can go out and evangelize. We can love the world as a sacred space and make it a better place for all creatures. Thank you. And